Hi, my name is Cheryl Brunette, and today we're going to work with pattern stitches and understanding multiples. For example, how do you translate 14 stitches, a multiple of 14 stitches plus 2 into that gorgeous afghan or cowl? The very definition of pattern means that you have repeated motifs. And you can see it in this child sweater that I played with. I just made it from the bottom up, and I arbitrarily set a pattern multiple of 4, and that let me play with all kinds of different things. I made it up on my way of knitting. I went, oh, that color looks good together. I just put a bunch of colors together in a basket and went for it. And some little kid will get it someday. This is a different kind of color patterning. This is mosaic style, and it was created by Barbara Walker. And it's a very easy kind of pattern to do. Mosaic knitting, I notice, is enjoying a renaissance these days, and I'm glad to see it because it's fun to do. This, of course, is a lace pattern, which relies both on the yarn overs, or the holes that you make, and the direction of the decreases that you use. If you just have holes without the decreases to enhance that pattern, sometimes it just looks like, I don't know, a bunch of holes. Looks like a bunch of little sea anemone mouths or something to me. I really enjoy the kinds of patterning that are sculptural. They use this decrease method. Here's another kind of patterning. These, of course, are cables. These are actually just 2 cables. There's one and there's one. When you put them together, they look like a much wider cable. This is just seed stitch. This is an old Gansey of mine. The top of the sleeves have just this occasional reverse purl row. So, of all these kinds of patterns, where do we get them from? Well, we can make them up, or mostly we get them from books, or nowadays we get them from the internet. And there has been a tendency over the last really 40 to 50 years to go from written directions on how to do things. This book is all written. There are no charts in it at all. And this is from, I think, the 80s. To this more modern book, which has charts exclusively. You can really see it in two of Barbara Walker's works, the second and third treasury of patterns. This was published in 1970. This was published in 1972. And she went from entirely written for her patterns to describe them to mostly charted. She has a couple of patterns where she's both charted and written them. And this is really a charming book. She hand did all of these. These look like they've been maybe done. No, they're hand done. You can see the little lines. So there is no standard set of abbreviations or set of symbols for all resources of knitted patterns. So every resource that you use, or any resource that you use, should have a really fine explanation of what the symbols mean. Now, this came up for me as a possible subject for a video, when I was going to make the pattern for the Beautiful Daughter Afghan. This is my original pattern. This is like it entirely. You see a kind of wrinkled piece of graph paper, and I used dots for my symbols for pearls. And I took this was an interpretation of Barbara Walker's pattern, Square Lattice, which you notice is entirely written, but I find that cumbersome to follow. For me, the visual format works better, and it's not that one format is better or than the other. My mother worked exclusively from written format, but she rewrote every pattern in her own little shorthand language, and she wrote it so that the stitches were above one another. Like if there were a purl and a knit and a purl, she would write it out each row, and she wrote it from the bottom, row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4. Okay, so as I was going to interpret this, into a real Afghan pattern that people could follow, I knew that this wasn't going to work. So I played around with a couple of things. I also know that some people prefer a visual pattern and some people prefer a written pattern. So I did do both. These are my preliminary exercises for developing a pattern. And this is, I forget the name of this knitting font, but it was a free knitting font that I got, and it uses the straight line for the purls and just a blank for a knit. Now, when you look at a chart, you are looking at the right side of the fabric. That's been a question I've heard before. And I decided to make it colored or not. And for myself, I printed out in grayscale, and it's easier for me to see. It's up to you. But this pattern is a 14 stitch repeat and 18 rows high, but it's 14 stitches plus 2 is how you read it. It's a multiple of 14 stitches plus 2. You can get a multiple of 9 stitches plus 18. You can get a multiple of 4 stitches plus 6. So what does that mean? And I've told you that these two right here, that's the multiple of 2. Or that's the plus 2. Here's the multiple, and there's the plus 2. So there was that experiment. There was that. I did end up with a pattern at the end. So here is the chart version. I really like to simplify stuff. And this is the entire written pattern. So you can work this pattern from either one. And I will put a link to the pattern below. But this is what it means to have a multiple of something plus, in this case, this is 14 plus 2. I reduced all of those charts and made a number of them, glued them to a piece of paper and copied them. This is a multiple. This is 14 stitches wide by 18 rows high. The same as this. You can see that they are uniform. So these are multiples of that pattern. What was it called? This something lattice? Square lattice, what you call it? Anyway, I forget its name. Here is the plus 2. So you could have that pattern multiply 100 times. You could use that multiple 100 times, and you only have to add 2. And what is that about? It's about balancing the pattern. If you were to look past this, these 2 stitches and these 2 stitches, both and 2 stitches, are identical. So when you get that plus 2 or plus 6, and sometimes they actually divide it on both sides of a panel, what you're getting are stitches to make it look symmetrically balanced. But one thing they don't tell you is if you're going to make a garment or an afghan, you want to balance the bottom and the top as well. So if I just did the multiples, the bottom of the afghan would not have looked like the top. So I took the top 2 stitches and I added them to the bottom. They don't tell you the multiples that you have on rows. And here's an example. I had one skein of this yarn left when I made the afghan, and I decided to make myself a cowl. Partly because I love this color, and partly because I wanted another example of this so I could show you, and partly because it has nice memories for me. So this is this chart. Here is this row down here, and those are the purls, right? So you can see those purls, and there are a couple of knits, and then there's a bunch of purls and a couple of knits. And then I worked that chart up to there, and I worked the chart a second time, and look at this. I didn't have enough yarn to work the entire third chart. However, this particular pattern lends itself to stopping halfway, and that's what I did. As long as the top and the bottom both had these bands of reverse stockinette stitch along with those knits, I don't think anyone is going to stop and notice that, oh, that's a half pattern on top instead of a whole pattern. So when you're working with multiples, the plus is always the plus whatever many stitches it is there to balance in this direction. But don't forget that you might want to balance in this direction. Human beings are pattern makers. Our brains and eyes want to create patterns even when they're not there, even when they're just trying to look at meaningless noise. There's a word for it, it's patternicity. And knitting is a wonderful example of how we are able to create thousands of patterns by combining a relatively small number of skills. Really, I haven't counted them all out, but if you can knit and purl, if you can decrease a few different ways, you have to know how to cast on, you have to know how to bind off, but there, in terms of creating pattern stitches, there really are a minimal number of skills that you can use to explore thousands of them. I hope you will be brave enough to start taking on some of those pattern stitches and creating some yourself even. So until I see you again, enjoy your knitting, play with patterns, and be brave, because it's just sticks and string after all. Bye. Hi, today I'm Cheryl Brunette. Tomorrow I might be someone else. Mary, thank you for this gorgeous, my favorite scarf. It's so beautiful, it's so warm, and I am so grateful to you. You're a doll.